Well, Isaac Sharp, welcome to A Pastor and Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to chat with you guys tonight.
We are too. So your book is The Other Evangelicals, a story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians and the movement that pushed them out. That's a mouthful and provocative right out of the gate. Tell us about yourself, Isaac, and where this book came from.
I am Isaac Sharp. I work here at Union Theological Seminary. I'm, in fact, in my office this evening. I graduated from Union with my PhD in 2019 and have worked in various roles here since that point. In that same stretch of time, I also, as you all may now be aware, as I'm looking at the book sitting on your desk, published this book, which is based in part on my dissertation. The in part it is definitely based on my dissertation, but when I say based in part, I mean it is part of my dissertation. This though it may be impossible for some folks to believe when they look at the page length of the book, the dissertation was actually a much longer project. There's this kind of sprawling look at all of these categories and at least a couple more in 20th century evangelical history. So this book was an initial attempt at carving out a kind of digestible chunk of the dissertation, and I hope that I have done that, focusing on some of what I think are, in one way of reading the story, some of the most kind of determinative chapters of the 20th century evangelical story. So that's a maybe too long-winded way of answering a simple question.
No, it's perfect. I mean, it's such it feels like a complete history of evangelicalism.
It does, which makes me want to know what the chapters.
Yeah, what did you cut out? What did we miss out of this?
And so based on some of your all's like showing of the hands of your hands with the a bit of what we might end up talking about today, you may have been interested actually in the major chapter that got carved out. So the biggest portion of the dissertation that didn't make it into the book was a chapter that it made it in a little bit in the introduction and sprinkled throughout, but there was a full 100-page plus chapter that was looking at the history of Armenian Wesleyan pietist traditions in evangelicalism and how those kind of cluster of evangelical types of traditions lost out in essence to the more reformed Calvinist or fundamentalist groups, and looking specifically, getting into some of the weeds of debates in quote unquote evangelical theology proper, kind of in the depths of some of the debates in places like the Evangelical Theological Society. And some of my editors at Erdman's perhaps wisely figured that in looking to a broader audience and hoping for a broader readership, that some of those in the weeds debates about Calvinism versus free will in evangelical theology might be a little much for readers of a book that's already this long. So there's this big chapter that is looking at that kind of evolution in evangelical theology that ends up kind of leading up to a high point of how the kind of neo-Calvinist reform stuff took over essentially evangelical theology. And the other chapter that I had to just condense and squash into a related chapter was there was a whole chapter about Karl Barth and Barthian evangelicals across the 20th century. So some of the deep weeds of evangelical theological debates are what ended up not making it in.
Probably the right call, but I also have questions about both of those things.
Yeah. And we can talk about that. And there may be some work that comes out of that at some point. We'll see.
Yep.
Cool.
Awesome. So when you look at the table of contents, or even just the subtitle of the book, you have chapters on liberal evangelicals, Black evangelicals, progressive evangelicals, feminist evangelicals, and as you put it, gay evangelicals or LGBTQ evangelicals. So it struck me that a conservative picking up your book and looking at the table of contents might think those are all the same thing and close the book and put it down. So can you briefly explain, emphasis on briefly, because this is a huge question, your choice of topics or perspectives to include, and also what's distinctive about those types of evangelicalism from each other, and what's distinctive about their critiques of what became what we all know as evangelicalism?
Yes. So it is certainly the case that there are different ways one can slice any of this. And there are folks that I feature in various chapters that could have potentially gone in other chapters, and they might have had overlap in either the groups that they moved in, constituencies that they were a part of, or even issues around theological commitments, or more concretely things like identity, questions of identity, personal identity, racial and ethnic identity, sexual orientation, these kinds of things, that there are folks who had potential overlap in various chapters who could have gone in another chapter. But slicing the puzzle the way I did, I think was justifiable in a variety of ways, based on sometimes folks' primary work or their kind of primary self-identification, at least for the periods I was looking at. So that was another kind of balancing game where I wanted to feature certain thinkers because of their contribution around debates about evangelicalism and race, or evangelicalism and gender identity, for instance, and a balancing act between that and kind of periodization, where it's kind of moves in waves. These things move in waves throughout the 20th century, and there's also overlap in time with folks. So roughly speaking, the chapters also kind of move chronologically, and I try to build it up that way. So some of the answer is I tried to go with the category of argument or flag that someone plants that ended up being most central at the periodization I had to use. But there are certainly other ways of slicing the puzzle. And to your point, there is the potential for certain kinds of readers to just paint all of these things as as different kinds of liberal, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or different kinds of progressive, but they're not, right? They're very different. And one of the great virtues of the book, if the reader is interested enough to stick it out for almost 300 pages or whatever it is discerning just how different they are and just how different their critiques are. For example, the liberal critique and the Black American critique, very different, sometimes incompatible in some ways. So
yeah. And for our listeners' sake, can you tell us the difference between liberal and progressive Christians?
Yeah, so this piece in particular is an important distinction, and ends up becoming a piece that a lot of folks want to push from a number of angles, right? So the distinction is important for a number of reasons, one of which is the liberal evangelicals, that first chapter. And I've said this a few different times in a few different places, but I think it is worth repeating, potentially for your all's audience, that any one of the chapters could vie for the most controversial, depending on who the reader is and what the context is. But the first chapter about liberal evangelicals certainly in certain contexts could be at the top of the list of most controversial, because I am doing something that is distinctly different from most histories of evangelicalism, which is, and so this is another winding way of answering the question about the distinction between progressive and liberal. But that chapter, which the point I was trying to make about what I'm doing that's a little different, is making an argument about the fact that evangelical identity in the 20th century was not as self-evidently tied to certain traditions as it later became, or as historians later painted it, such that for a period of time back to the early 20th century, when there were these things called the fundamentalist modernist controversies and kind of divergence between two traditions in American Protestantism, between the liberal mainline and the conservative evangelical tradition, that generally speaking, historians talk about that divergence as pretty distinctive and definitive, and that shapes the 20th century evolution of Protestantism. And there's something to that. It's not entirely inaccurate, but part of what I'm doing with that first chapter is making an argument about evangelical identity and the fact that it was messier for longer than folks realize, such that you get some folks who, and this is, I promise I'm going to land this plane now, some folks who would identify themselves as liberal as Christians who are liberal theologically, who would identify with liberal theology in some capacity. And by that, it can mean a variety of different things, but a couple within the context that would mean would be willingness, for instance, to embrace Darwinian evolution, for instance, and or higher textual criticism of the Bible as tools that are possible to be appropriated within one's faith and still be a faithful Christian. And so this is the divide among the kind of fundamentalist modernist controversies. And you have these folks who fall on the quote unquote more liberal side of things, who would have said things like, we can potentially entertain the idea of Darwinian evolution with certain readings of Genesis that are not necessarily literal readings that treat the early chapters as a scientific textbook about six-day creation, and or can use historical critical methodologies to better understand the Bible without sacrificing our Christian identity, and for some specifically their evangelical identity. So you get these folks who are identifying with what became known as liberal theology, who also said, no, we are evangelical. And by that, many of these folks would mean something like, we're still faithful to the gospel, to the good news, the message of Jesus. Progressives, the evangelical progressives, which is a later chapter and emerges later in the 20th century context, tend to be folks who would reject some or all of liberal theological traditions, or at least would identify with quote unquote conservative theology, evangelical theology, affirmations of the authority of the Bible and or inerrancy of the Bible, but who interprets that inerrant Bible as having political implications that fall on the progressive side of the spectrum. So that was an extremely long way of answering. Chapter 1, liberals, is talking about liberals more theologically speaking, and the chapter on progressive evangelicals is talking more exclusively about politics.
Yeah, it's why I love history so much, because as I was reading that first chapter about the theologically liberal, and I'm using scare quotes because it's just so it's very tamely liberal.
Yeah.
But people like, who was it? Harry Emerson Fosdick, and did I get that right?
Yeah.
All right. I don't want to be made fun of because of that name. And Charles Briggs and others who were having these same arguments 130 years ago that I'm having now, whether it's about biblical inerrancy, about science, evolution, historical critical approach to the scriptures. This is not new, and that's so encouraging and beautiful to me. That's why history is so cool.
Yeah, and that in particular, actually, that's a excellent segue to a point about why I ended up including that chapter. And one of the reasons I did is this thread that I traced through several of the chapters, actually, that is an example of debates that are recurrent across the 20th century evangelical context. I wanted to include that chapter in particular because of that, right? So as an example, you get this thing that happens among 20th century evangelical thinkers where it will seem settled for a generation that evolution or this question of science, right, and integration of science and faith is a settled matter in evangelical circles, right? Even the idea evangelicals are not embracing evolution. And then 10 years later, there will be a new debate that is essentially the same debate among a new generation of evangelical thinkers that is relitigating very much the same debate. And so including that chapter was in some ways was motivated by this idea that these quote unquote liberal trends, that what get called liberal trends in theological discourse, like embrace of some sort of higher critical methodology or acceptance of some sort of Darwinian theory of the evolution of species, that these things kept recurring in 20th century evangelical circles, almost like clockwork, like along, some of it's along like every 10 years it happens that this debate happens again. And so that was an example of something that I do try to do throughout the book, that is show that many of the current debates in evangelical circles happened a long, long time ago, and that there were folks on quote unquote both sides of these debates going back decades.
Yeah, you did a great job of it.
Yeah, Randy found that fact encouraging and beautiful, and I found it frustrating and
Sure.
depressing. I mean, because
That's fair.
you just think about it on a practical level, like nobody reads books written more than 50 years ago, like almost nobody. And that includes scholars too, because you can't publish on something that's been beaten to death. And so we're just doomed and in this cycle to say the same shit over and over every 40 or 50 years. And that's very depressing. And this book brings that out nicely.
Yeah, there's I won't let it, I'll try to keep us from going too far down the rabbit hole on this one, but a recent example of this in kind of like online discourse that I've seen is there's this like continuing effort to basically do the same thing that J. Gresham Machen did back in the early 20th century. And Machen was this fundamentalist figure who wrote this book arguing that liberals are not Christians, essentially that liberalism is a different religion. And you get that the self-same version of that argument in books that came out, a couple of years ago now, or within the last 2 years, that are making the arguments about like Christianity and wokeness, how they're different religions. And it is essentially just a like reconfiguring of J. Gresham Machen's argument that he made all the way back in the early 20th century. So yeah, can be frustrating and or encouraging depending on your perspective, but definitely fascinating.
Yeah,
I choose encouraging.
There you go. That's like kind of sums up our podcast in a lot of ways. I think so. Choose encouragement. Okay, so let me ask a quick follow-up that's not on the outline, because I'm interested and it is related to something that will come up later. So you said for like the liberal Christians, for example, the sense in which they were evangelical is that they really cared about the gospel. But that's not distinctive to evangelicalism. It's not distinctive to any Christian tradition. I know lots of Catholics who care deeply about the gospel. I know lots of Lutherans who do, and Eastern Orthodox people who do, and on and on and on. So, and this is going to relate to a question I have later about the slipperiness of the word evangelical. It seems like it can mean almost anything depending on who's using it. And at a certain point, it makes you wonder, is anybody evangelical, or is there any sense in trying to figure out what this means?
This is a fascinating question, and it is definitely the case that one of the complicated questions and debates in scholarship about evangelicals, but also among kind of, insider debates among evangelicals, is this distinction question, right? Like what makes, and in part, this is the task of the whole book in some ways. So it definitely relates to anything we'll talk about, because this is part of the argument that I'm making, that because of the nebulous nature of what it means to be evangelical, or how to define evangelicalism, or even classifying what it is, right? Is it a movement, a tradition, a theology, an aesthetic, an idiomatic, in-group cultural kind of distinction? There are all these ways of slicing it, that it does become an interesting question. What makes evangelical Christians different from other Christians? Part of the argument of the book is that there was this concerted effort on the part of those who claimed evangelical identity to make that distinction very hard, to make it very clear that we evangelicals are different from other Christians. And in fact, I don't know if I say this explicitly, but I've summarized parts of the book in a gloss that in other places, discussions, and maybe even just online spaces or tweets or something, that one of the ways that evangelical gatekeeping has functioned, I argue, is as a way of designating, quote unquote, true Christians. We evangelicals are the real Christians, and all those non-evangelicals are the heretics or backsliders or outsiders or what have you, whatever your preferred designation of to cast aspersions on somebody's faith is. And that has been one of the ways that evangelical identity has functioned. Even in actually the liberal evangelicals chapter, you see a bit of that prefigured in the way certain folks used evangelical to mean to include certain kinds of liberal theology, but not other kinds of liberal theology. So you get this distinction that emerges, and it's all but forgotten now. in the kind of historical record of like an evangelical liberalism versus other kinds of liberalism. And one example of that distinction making with some of the quote unquote liberal evangelicals was to suggest that we evangelical liberals are different from, say, Unitarians, right? Those Unitarians are just in it, this would be some evangelical liberals. They're just anything goes. And we evangelical liberals are still holding on to something distinctive about the gospel. But to the question about what makes that different than, say, Catholic Christians or Eastern Orthodox Christians, that's a great question, and it is a perennial one for anybody who's interested in this question of identifying as evangelical, right? Like, what does that mean, and what does that distinction mean? It's in part the task of the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. I'm gonna have more about that later, so let's put a pin in it. But I want to ask you about historiography a little bit. And particularly the group that you call the new generations of historians of evangelicalism. I forget what chapter that is, but people like George Marsden and Mark Knoll and a couple others that I hadn't heard of, Carpenter Hatch, etc. So they're evangelicals writing evangelical history. I've read Knoll, I've read a little bit of Marsden, and they do it really well. Like they're good at it. It's believable, speaking as a very much liberal non-evangelical. It's still like good history. But their role in defining what evangelicalism came to mean was something that I had never thought to question, and how it might have probably unintentionally pushed out some other kinds of perspectives. So you mentioned people like Donald Dayton, for example, who had a very different take on the history of evangelicalism. So can you speak to both how I'm going to put them in a category that Dayton put them in. They're the kind of reformed category, and complexify that if you want to, but how their view came to be kind of the standard view of the history of evangelicalism, and then where are you trying to situate yourself in that conversation?
This is another of the deep in the weeds questions that I find fascinating, that I will try to make as lively and interesting for listeners as possible. Because historiography,
a little more concrete, just
no, please.
Take home point that other people might also care about. So one of the things Knoll is famous for is saying evangelicals have a big anti-intellectualism problem.
Right. Yeah.
And I was very persuaded by that, because all the evangelicals I've ever known had a big anti-intellectualism problem.
Yeah, right.
And so, but maybe that's part of his tradition.
Yeah.
That he sees it that way. Might just be because he's ignoring all the Wesleyans. I don't know. So,
right.
So how should we read historians who make claims like that, given that they're coming from a kind of, it's not parochial, but a particular tradition?
Yeah. So this evolution of the kind of history of the histories of evangelicalism is so fascinating, because I use it as the kind of table setting early thing in the book to lay the groundwork for how we got where we are with this kind of like constant discourse about evangelicals, right? My book is a contribution to that, this like ongoing wave after wave of fascination and discussion with the evangelicals. And so part of what I end up tracing is that this really interesting thing happens across the 20th century in academic settings, and specifically in the kind of professional and academic study of history. And it is this like interesting development where evangelicalism as a category or as a movement gets ignored for a long time across 20th century evangelical historical or 20th century historical work. And in the early 80s, you get this emergence of these folks like Marsden and Knoll, who basically end up offering supply for a rising demand of interest in evangelicals that comes on the tail of Jimmy Carter in 1976 saying, "I've been born again," and then the rise of the religious right. You get all of a sudden folks are interested, like, what is this? What is it? Where did all these evangelicals come from, right? Like, who are these people? Where did they come from? And you get this first generation of what I call, the early evangelical historians like Marsden and Knoll, who come along and write. They meet the rising demand with supply by writing these fantastically well done, rigorous, thorough histories of a tradition that they have some relationship to, right? So this becomes an interesting phenomenon over time, in that you also get folks like, for instance, Randall Balmer, who would maybe be an example of like an early ex-evangelical, right? So you get other historians who were perhaps once a part of the evangelical tradition who no longer necessarily identify with it because of what it became, and that this is a part of the story of the shaping of evangelical history. So to the Marsden and Dayton thing, to see if I can do a quick gloss on that without getting too far in the weeds. Folks like Marsden and Knoll end up setting the kind of canonical account of the evolution of contemporary evangelicalism out of fundamentalism, with precursors in fundamentalism, and the evolution across the 20th century of the quote unquote neo evangelical movement as the kind of mainstream version of evangelicalism. And their history is exactly right in one way of rendering the story. That is the centerpiece story of what became mainstream evangelicalism in the 20th century. That is the case. But part of what I am trying to do is to suggest, in a slightly different way than what Dayton would be doing, but in a similar kind of poise, to say that the story is more complicated than that story. And one of the questions I was wanting to ask is how the mainstream version of the story became the mainstream version of the story, right? Like, you don't just get it's not just self-evident. Someone steps out and says, yes, here is mainstream evangelicalism, and this is the story we're going to tell, right? Like, that had to happen over time. So part of what I suggest is that historians had a role in focusing on the evolution of neo-evangelicalism. They're centering something in the evangelical story. And in that story, I suggest there are perhaps smaller players and less well-known players that also affected how that mainstream version became mainstream. I'll pause there in case that slightly gets at the kind of question you were asking.
It does a bit. Thank you. Yeah. And I think it's a good segue into Randy's next question, because surprise, surprise, a lot of that story has to do with certain groups of evangelicals actively pushing out other groups of evangelicals. And that's kind of what Randy's about to ask about, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's almost like we have an outline that we're
almost.
One of the things incredible to me in this book is how fantastically and depressingly consistent evangelicalism has been from the jump, in that two areas. First thing that I want to hear from you on is that evangelicals have been known more for who and what we are against, or they are against, than who and what they are for. And you even quoted the founding statement or the Constitution or whatever of the National Evangelical Association, which I think came together in 1942. And I've got 3 exclamation points by this line. It says, this is in the bylaws or something. It says, we realize that in many areas of Christian endeavor, the organizations which now purport to be the representatives of Protestant Christianity have departed from the faith of Jesus Christ. How, like, just completely laying waste to the whole tradition of Protestant Christianity. That's the way evangelicalism started in its formality, as the National Association of Evangelicals formed. And it was before that, I think probably too, right? Can you explain to us this first inclination of who we're against?
Yes. So this is a fascinating question on the longer arc of the history of evangelicalism, and one that I had to bracket a little bit. So this question of how far back you can trace evangelical history is a really complicated one as well. And for the book to not be, 2,000 pages, I had to set some boundaries. And so focusing on the 20th century context of what I end up doing. And what I end up arguing is, regardless of if there was something called the evangelical tradition going way back, back into previous centuries, 19th, 18th, that in the 20th century US context, something different was happening with this question of evangelicalism as a movement and evangelical identity. And to a previous point that we were discussing, one of the different things that I argue is that it becomes this kind of proprietary trademark name, this brand that a certain group of conservative Protestants Christians in the US context claim as a way of differentiating themselves from other Christians by suggesting, in effect, that we are the good, conservative, Bible-believing Christians, and we had to establish these organizations because all of the rest of the Protestant, interdenominational organizations and the powers that be in Protestantism at the time in, say, the mid 20th century are heretics, right? Like this is made pretty explicit, even if not using the language of heresy, using the kind of language you described with the National Association of Evangelicals that says we look around. This would be the kind of the architects behind evangelical identity in the 20th century, the post-World War II rise of the neo-evangelicals, the folks who established organizations like the NAE, said things, this is glossing and summarizing. We look around and we see no real faithful Christian leaders left, and we got to start something to be a counterexample of good, faithful Christianity. And what they called it was evangelical. And it was explicitly, I'm so glad you asked this question, because this doesn't come out in some of the interviews. And this is an extremely important piece of 20th century evangelical history, especially as it relates to current debates, right? Of this in-group, out-group stuff. It is the case, I argue, that what became mainstream evangelical identity in the 20th century context was explicitly established as a what we're against move. We, good, faithful evangelicals, are against those backsliding mainline Protestant liberals who are heretics and socialists and whatever else they could use to label. And you see it in the establishment of groups like the NAE, which is explicitly a counter to groups like the emergence of like the World Council of Churches, the ecumenical movement. Christianity Today, explicitly founded as an alternative to the Christian Century. Fuller Theological Seminary has something in its language that is a similar kind of, we looked around and could see no faithful interdenominational Christian seminaries, and so we had to start one. And so that differentiation, to the previous point we discussed, it's baked in to 20th century evangelical identity, that this distinction that evangelicals are the good, real Christians and everybody else on the outside are the questionably Christians. That's baked in there from the early rise of this interdenominational movement.
Yeah. And similarly, the idea of ecumenism being, like, to me, ecumenism is a huge virtue. And I was a good evangelical when I started my church, 17 years ago. And didn't seek out ecumenical relationships and collaboration, all that stuff. And now it's my heartbeat. And that's because I was a good evangelical. I didn't care about ecumenism. I cared about us and our people. That's been happening since the beginning, it seems like, as well, right?
Yeah, it's such an interesting aspect of 20th century and into the 21st century evangelical history, because it is definitely the case that what became the mainstream version of the movement was formed as an anti-ecumenical enterprise, right? That ecumenical movement is dangerous for a number of reasons. One that some would suggest, evangelical leaders would suggest, watering down the gospel, or things like getting into some of the, I didn't do too much of this in the book, but looking at something like dispensationalism and eschatology, this idea that the ecumenical movement is somehow tied to this idea of a one world church that maybe is based on a certain reading of the book of Revelation. So you get that anti-ecumenical impulse, but also, and I didn't get into too much of this either, the view among certain conservative evangelical leaders and gatekeepers in mid-century that the ecumenical movement was too, not only too liberal theologically, but too progress, artificial distinctions here, too progressive politically, as like you get scholars who have argued persuasively, I think, that another aspect of shaping evangelical identity in 20th century was this tie to like big business and corporate interests and anti-New Dealism and free market ideology. I didn't get too much into that stuff, but that also is definitely related to this like anti-ecumenical impulse. The interesting thing to me is, in a different, aside from just the ecumenical movement, in a different understanding of what it means to be, if you zoom out to a more general kind of interdenominational cooperative efforts, right? If you take that as like one of the bases of the ecumenical movement, evangelicals become a very interdenominationally cooperative enterprise across the 20th century, just to very different ends than the, quote unquote mainline ecumenical movement.
Yeah. You mentioned Christianity Today. and Kyle beat me to it sometimes when we read. Well, Kyle's always first to the outline for us, and there were two words that were littered throughout your book, and that's Christianity Today. I wound up just like circling them every time I saw those two words, and it was like twice a page. I'll let Kyle ask the rest of the question, but I was so struck by how much of a presence Christianity Today had in this book.
Yeah, particularly though, like what has its trajectory been like, and what role has it played in normativizing what we've come to know as mainstream evangelicalism, the type that you've just been describing, and where do you view its place now vis-a-vis that kind of evangelicalism? Because it's transformed quite a bit, but there's still seeds. I don't want to give my cards away, but I want to hear your take.
Yeah, let me think about how I want to take a run at. There's a lot you just dropped in that question that I could respond to, and I want to take a run at a couple of different. One of which is Christianity Today has been a gatekeeper, trendsetter for the evolution of this evangelical identity that I'm talking about, as the kind of like center ring where who gets published in who gets published in Christianity Today has a powerful effect on what is theologically, socially, politically acceptable in evangelical circles, right? So an example that I end up talking about in the book, that is one that I had only seen talked about in like passing articles here or there, but never really seen like a full-on reckoning with until maybe some beginning recently. Christianity Today emerges very close to the same time of the emergence of the mainstream civil rights movement in this country. And that's an interesting opportunity historically, because the early framing of Christianity Today under the guidance of initial editor Carl Henry was to suggest that fundamentalists had gone too far in becoming too sectarian and too walled off from the broader social world and social problems, and unwilling to engage with the broader culture. So what an opportune time for the emergence of Christianity Today in the context of the emergence of the mainstream civil rights movement. And you get this fascinating thing that happens where there's little to no engagement for a long period of time. And then when the engagement comes, it initially ends up being this kind of both-sider thing where you have Christianity Today platforming segregationists who are making arguments in the pages of Christianity Today of why Christians must support segregation. And that is, I think, that has a normativizing effect on what is acceptable discourse for quote unquote official evangelicals, right? Like fast forward today, it would be unheard of, one would imagine, and unthinkable for Christianity Today to be featuring kind of, some far right neo segregationist, which is a sentiment that's like on the rise in this country. But there has been, to my knowledge, little reckoning with that history on the part of the magazine itself. That would be an interesting place to begin this question of what role has that magazine played in setting certain boundaries around who can speak both for evangelicals, but to evangelicals, and what kind of topics are able to be discussed, right, or debated. It certainly has had that effect in just to the simple fact that it's the evangelicalism, 20th century American evangelicalism's most important publication far and away. There's nothing that really can touch it. And that has had an important role.
There's another thread that keeps winding its way through, again, to me, encouraging that it's nothing new, to some depressing that it's nothing new. This idea of this deep commitment to biblical inerrancy. It seems like it's kind of the root of all evils in many ways within evangelicalism, which keeps us from advancing, I want to say, and having a more biblical mindset. Can you just speak to the biblical inerrancy piece of the history of evangelicalism?
The question of the authority of the Bible becomes central to definitions of 20th century evangelical identity, and inerrancy becomes the most common way of describing what becomes the sometimes official, sometimes unofficial evangelical position. So you get another organization, for instance, like the Evangelical Theological Society, for its entire history has had a one-line statement of faith where if you can sign it, you are in group official evangelical theologian, and it is inerrancy. If you can affirm inerrancy, that is what makes you an evangelical theologian versus all the other kinds of Christian theologians. That, to tie back in one little piece that we didn't talk too much about, it's why Karl Barth becomes so problematic among 20th century evangelical theologians, because Barth was by no means an inerrantist when it came to the authority of the Bible. So inerrancy becomes a litmus test often. If you can affirm inerrancy, you're in. You are a faithful evangelical thinker. Oftentimes it's in the context of theologians or professors at evangelical colleges or seminaries. The problem, I suggest, is what to do about two evangelicals who both affirm inerrancy and then reach dramatically different conclusions about interpretation of an inerrant Bible. Either, a theological interpretation or the application of a theological tenet that they agree upon in the political or social realm. Right? It is a recurrent problem that inerrancy does not solve the problem of interpretation. And often I suggest because of that, what ends up happening is power struggles, right? Where you have two evangelical groups. Some of this did fall out of the book because a lot of this came in that chapter about the Armenian Wesleyan Pietist tradition versus the Reformed Calvinist tradition, because that's a prime example where you get both sides affirming, yes, we affirm the authority of the Bible, but we have dramatically different understandings of how God and salvation work. Like really dramatically different understandings of how it even works for one to be saved in the classic evangelical idiom. And that is a tension that doesn't go away, right? This question of what to do about interpretation. To other chapters, right? The chapter about feminism and gender roles, which is another of those. There are current debates that are happening sometimes among evangelicals about that right now that seem like that has never been argued before in evangelical circles, where you get this divergence, you get convergence among certain groups of evangelicals on 18, on a dozen different points. And then a few passages that have been interpreted to indicate what the Bible has to say about gender roles. Divergence over those passages becomes this kind of in-group, out-group thing where you get those who are in power suggesting that if you disagree with their interpretation, you must obviously have given up on inerrancy. And part of the arguments that I don't know if I make it this explicitly, but I think this is part of the story that I'm telling, is that what happens is you get inerrancy of interpretation, where it is the case that those in power set the interpretation and what is the acceptable interpretation. And then if you challenge them, the move on their part is to say, well, obviously, then you don't affirm the authority of the Bible. Because if you did affirm the authority of the Bible, you would reach the conclusion that I have reached about how to vote or what women's role in church is. Again, another way too long answer to maybe what was a much simpler question, but I hope that gets at some of what you were hoping for there.
It does. Thank you, Isaac.
Yeah, and our listeners know what we think about inerrancy. They can go back in their feed and find out if they don't recall. But I would go a step even further and say,
yeah, please.
There is no inerrancy without a power struggle. It just is a power struggle. And that's not to say that all inerrantists are consciously struggling for power. That's not true at all. There are many sincere, gentle Christians who believe in inerrancy. I know many of them, including some leaders, but it is to say that there is no such thing as a doctrine of inerrancy without the attempt to control the meaning of the text and to apply it in certain ways to exclude certain groups of people and their interpretation of the text. It just doesn't exist without that. It was founded in an attempt to do that. So yeah, it's utterly indefensible in our view. There are very few things we come down hard on in our show.
Inerrancy is one of them. So, yeah.
It's good. They could have been it's a fascinating project. The history of inerrancy would be a book I would love to read.
Yeah.
Well, you should write it.
You should. Okay, so let me ask you about this might be the question I most wanted to ask you, actually. So we had, and it's kind of nerdy. We had an episode, one of our first episodes 3 years ago, whenever we started the show, about evangelicalism. And in attempting to define it while recognizing that it's hard to define, we did the standard thing, and we defined it according to the quadrilateral.
Bebbington's quadrilateral.
No, mostly identified with David Bebbington, who interestingly is not American. But for whatever reason, American evangelicalism came to be associated with those four distinctives, or whatever you want to call them. And there's a version of that that shows up towards the end of your book. You don't call it that, I don't think, but it's basically what it is. And so what do you think about that way of thinking about what evangelicalism is? Do you think it's been helpful? Is there any value to it? Do you think it's part of the problem? Because defining it that way automatically excludes, for example, almost all the liberals and a lot of the other people that you talk about in the book. And one of the ways I knew, when I wasn't an evangelical anymore was when I went back and looked at that and thought, I don't hold any of those anymore. So
I would disagree with that. I think you can hold to the Bebbington's quadrilateral and still be not evangelical.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yes. And so that does complicate it, right? Because you can, there are other reasons to not be evangelical for sure. So it's not merely belief oriented, but it is a thing that, if I don't hold any of those, what's keeping me here, essentially. So what do you think about that way of framing it?
This one is extremely complicated for a number of reasons, and I'll try to simplify an answer here to be brief on this issue, because this is such a fascinating piece of the puzzle. So I wouldn't suggest that the Bebbington quadrilateral as an example of an effort to define evangelicalism is just wrong or useless. By no means. It is naming something and identifying something. I think the difficulty is, and this actually ties to this will bring back us full circle on a couple of other questions and topics that we discussed here. One of which is relationship to kind of a new generation of historians looking at evangelicalism versus a previous generation, and one related to your previous suggestion about inerrancy's inherent tie to power and power struggle. So I think that one intervention that I'm hoping the book makes is around this question of defining evangelicalism and suggesting that at the times when it was painted as about theology, right? When evangelical identity and in-group, out-group stuff was presented by evangelical leaders, power brokers, scholars, what have you, as identifying these theological tendencies that describe someone or identify someone as evangelical versus not, that in those instances, and this is kind of, maybe this is a diplomatic way of taking a both and approach, that in those instances, when it was putatively about theology, it was at least also sometimes about power. Yeah. Right. So without purely painting every scholar of evangelicalism or evangelical gatekeeper as having some sort of nefarious motives that, are not pure in their theological intentions. I'm not doing that, or I'm not trying to do that. But to suggest that at times when it was presented as just pure theology, that questions of identity and power and social location and power struggles and inter-evangelical debates were also at play, where it was never just this kind of pure, yes, here is the theological criteria, and if you meet them, you are in. And here's why. And so this actually ties it back to the book. Because there are folks in every chapter I talk about who would meet that criteria, right? Who would meet the Bebbington quadrilateral, or even more specific, there are longer lists of even more specific criteria that folks have ventured. Pollsters like the Barna group, for instance, at one point, I think had this 12-point, there's some kind of long list of beliefs that they suggest these are the evangelical beliefs, or inerrancy, that there are folks in every chapter, I would argue, who could meet those criteria, and yet for one reason or another, they got marginalized, pushed out, or written out of the history. And in part, that is because, and part of what then maybe I would suggest is that something like the Bebbington quadrilateral is not enough to encompass everything that was happening in this thing called evangelicalism in the 20th century US context. There was this subcultural development thing going on. There was this in-group, out-group movement thing going on. There was power struggles. There was this identity thing going on, this kind of trademark, proprietary, putting a, branding thing going on, and that all of these aspects must be taken into account when we consider what it means to be evangelical, such that it's not just purely about theology. Maybe that would be a big kind of 30,000 feet way of trying to answer that question.
Yeah. I want to say that I have a feeling that if evangelicalism really oriented itself around that quadrilateral, we wouldn't have nearly as many problems as we do today. But instead, evangelicalism has gone outside of that quadrilateral and made it all about whether it's inerrancy or whiteness or power or, anti-gayness or all of the stuff. We've made it about everything except for that quadrilateral, I want to say.
Black Christianity is a perfect example of that argument, in that scholars, even today, contemporary scholars writing about the history of Black Christianity in this country consistently say things like, by any theological definition, Black Christians are the most consistently evangelical tradition of Christianity in this country, and yet are not identified with quote unquote evangelicalism proper, and in fact don't want to identify with quote unquote evangelicalism proper, and yet meet any of those theological criteria. What's going on there, right? That's part of the story I'm trying to get at. There's something else going on there.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. So staying on this theme of power struggle just for another minute. So I guess the question is, what do you hope your book is going to accomplish? But I didn't want to put it quite so pointedly, but like the recognition of the power struggle to define evangelicalism and police its boundaries. That is kind of the focus of the book as I read it. What do you hope comes out of that? Like, so one thing that I could see you hoping come out of it is that a lot of people who are, use the word deconstructing if you want, whatever, they feel pushed out by evangelicalism, and they'll see themselves in its history, and they'll see that not only is this not new, it's been going on the whole damn time. And there are, lots and lots of people, very smart people, who have written copious amounts of really good stuff, who, have made the arguments that I'm trying to make, and they'll feel at home in that. But I also wonder, are there a lot of people like that left? Like, are there a lot of liberals, for example, trying to hold on to some sort of non-mainstream version of evangelical? I know there are a few, but it also seems like most of them have kind of given up.
A quick and short answer, and then a longer. A quick and short answer is at least one of the goals that I hope for the book is just that in the writing of history, I think one of the powerful things that history writing can do is show contingency, right? Demonstrate that things were not necessarily inevitable or, taking a deterministic view. It was not necessarily the case that evangelicalism would have become what it did. That's one hope that the book demonstrates. For readers, for, an individual reader, I hope that, and part of the reason that I centered biography as a central feature. I wanted to tell some folks stories. If it is the case that someone reads stories herein and feels a little less alone, that would be incredibly gratifying to me, right? Because I also try to take seriously and honor these folks' stories that this is like being excommunicated, pushed out, marginalized from one's religious community is a big deal. This is like can be a world-shattering thing, and perhaps there are those who are going through something like that currently who feel like they are the only one. Part of that, I think, is a product of what evangelicalism became, in that it became this kind of totalizing culture where it, at least in certain pockets, became like the water that folks swim in. I talked about this on a recent interview with somebody about the book, where I think it is the case that there are folks who are raised in a religious tradition that might be described as evangelicalism, who somewhere along the way question one piece of the puzzle. And it might, and the distinctions here also, I don't want to draw too in fast. It might be cultural more than theological, or political more than theological. And I don't think we can so neatly separate all of those things. But I do, this is conjecture, think it's the case that many folks who would be going through so-called deconstruction right now saw one aspect of something of this culture, and because of how it was presented to them, just as this is Christianity, it becomes like the house of cards that comes tumbling down, where if one questions the de facto evangelical orthodoxy on politics, for instance, one is made to believe that one has also questioned one's entire faith. Maybe that would be a little bit conjectural, little armchair psychology with some of the current inflection point around the deconstruction ex-evangelical. It seems that this is a thing that is happening right now in a broader kind of folks are connecting with one another about it. So if in those spaces folks are able to get their hands on the book, I think one of the goals is to demonstrate that this isn't the first time that folks have been forced to ask these hard questions about their faith community, because in certain instances, it wasn't even about theological distinctions or theological choices, right? If you are a Black evangelical moving in this movement and you identify with all of the theological criteria, and yet somehow you are constantly being made to feel less than in evangelical spaces, that is not something that you have not chosen to deconstruct. And this is a story that goes back decades.
It's been forced upon you. Yeah. This is what was my last question / compliment, is that I'm so grateful for this book and for books like it, Isaac, that show a way back into the church for people who say, I can't do evangelicalism anymore. We drop the faith altogether. And I want to say, I love the church. I'm passionate about the church, and I think Jesus loves the church. And I don't think Jesus cares so much about the evangelical church or any other tradition or denomination. Jesus just cares about the church. And I love that this is perhaps a way back into the church, back into following Jesus outside of evangelicalism, that this has been going on for 150, maybe more years. So I'm really appreciative of that, Isaac.
Yeah. Last question. Do you consider yourself an evangelical? I'm sure you've been asked this numerous times.
The $1,000,000,000 question. Actually, maybe not so pointedly. I'm trying to recall if anybody, people dance around it a bit in other interviews, but I don't know. They dance around it by asking questions. So so what is your background in faith tradition or what have you? And I don't know that anybody has this actually may be the first time. Are you evangelical? By the definition of the story that I told in the book, what evangelical means, no, I would not fit what I believe it means to be evangelical in the contemporary U.S. context. Now, my background is an interesting story that maybe is a podcast discussion for another day, and maybe actually could be a whole other book, because there's a story to tell here. In that I grew up in the South in Tennessee in Southern Baptist context, and the Southern Baptists have a very interesting relationship to this evangelical story. And so the context I grew up in could be described as evangelical, but that language, that identifier, wasn't necessarily used, which is a particular kind of thing. It wasn't, we weren't talking. Those around me in Southern Baptist context were not saying things like we are evangelicals, we are Southern Baptists. And that's an interesting wrinkle on this, which is maybe also a slight bit of a dodge of the question.
But it's common though, because I was surrounded by Pentecostals for years, and it was the same phenomenon that nobody thought of themselves as evangelical, but they were.
Right. Yes.
Standard metrics.
Yes. So maybe that is like no one in the context growing up, the folks I was around would not have been thinking of themselves in that way, but arguably are by many of the definitional criteria. But along my own personal journey, I parted ways with that particular tradition and denominational upbringing, as have many. So I, by many, many criteria, especially if you asked folks who are currently those interested in doing some of the gatekeeping around what it means to be evangelical. There are many things that probably disqualify me. That would be a diplomatic way to put it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Isaac Sharp, the book is The Other Evangelicals, the story of liberal, Black, progressive, feminist, and gay Christians in the movement that pushed them out. Thanks for writing this. Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your thoughts, thoughtfulness, and care on this matter.
Yeah, thanks so much for engaging. I appreciate it.
Awesome.